Okay, so today we're going to do a deep dive into something pretty intense, actually.
Yeah, this is
You sent me some analysis about Iran, and
yeah,
the question that kind of jumps out at you is like, is the Islamic Republic of Iran
right.
like on the verge of collapse?
Yeah,
And it's specifically about the economic picture.
yeah,
And we've got some fascinating material that you shared
right.
that really gets into the weeds on Iran's economic struggles and draws some pretty stark
Yeah.
comparisons with what happened in Afghanistan back in the late
Uh-huh.
90s.
Right.
So what we're going to try to do today is unpack these arguments and understand
Yeah,
those historical parallels being made
exactly.
and really pinpoint those critical factors that could
Mhm.
signal a real crisis brewing in Iran.
Yeah.
We want to give everybody listening a much clearer picture
Right.
of this complex situation without overwhelming you with all the detail.
Yeah. No, that's the goal, to make
Th-
this digestible.
Okay, let's jump right in.
Yeah, so I think what immediately grabs your attention with this is just the boldness of the argument. I mean, it doesn't mince words. It's suggesting that the Iranian economy is on the verge of a total breakdown,
Wow.
and that the current government's time might be very limited.
Okay.
We're talking weeks or months.
Wow.
So that's a huge claim. And
Yeah.
so we need to dig into the evidence that they're using to support it.
Absolutely. And the first piece of evidence that really jumps out
Yeah.
is pretty staggering. I mean, the Iranian currency,
All right.
the toman, reportedly hitting 100,000 tomans to the U.S. dollar
Yeah.
on the open market.
It's crazy.
I mean, just let that sink in for a minute.
Yeah.
100,000 tomans for a single dollar.
I mean,
Okay.
it paints a bleak picture on its own.
Really does.
Yeah.
And then the analysis pivots to this historical comparison
Right.
with Afghanistan, and it really throws this number into sharp relief.
Mm-hmm. It does. I mean, if we connect this to the broader historical context, the comparison to Afghanistan in 1997 is not just striking, it's quite disturbing.
Okay.
The text reminds us of a period of intense civil war and fragmentation in Afghanistan where even the currency system
Wow.
had fractured along with the territorial lines of the country.
Right.
So you had different versions of the Afghani circulating, depending on whether it was the old communist government's Afghani of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan,
Wow.
or the Afghani of the Junbishi Milli Islami in the north.
Oh, my goodness.
So it really highlights a state of extreme disunity and economic chaos.
Wow. And it wasn't just different currencies floating around.
Yeah.
I mean, the country was effectively split into
Yeah.
7 zones of power, as the text describes it.
Yeah.
And this term really captures it, HEO.
Yeah.
Essentially a situation where central authority has completely broken down, and you've got these smaller territories controlled by local strongmen with their own rules, their own militias often.
Right. It was very much a warlord situation.
Yeah, and here's where it gets really unsettling.
Yeah.
Even in that environment of war and fragmentation,
Yeah.
the exchange rates weren't as disastrous as what Iran is experiencing right now.
Yeah, precisely. The text explicitly states that in 1997, the U.S. dollar traded at around 80,000 Afghanis in northern Afghanistan,
Okay.
and about 40,000 Afghanis in Kabul, where the Islamic government's currency was more prevalent.
Okay.
And they really make a point of emphasizing that the current exchange rate for the Iranian toman is actually worse than even these figures from a country being torn apart by civil war.
Yeah, and what's really unsettling here isn't just like the worst exchange rate, but the fact that, Iran has like a significantly more complex economy than Afghanistan did back then.
Oh, absolutely.
A currency collapse of this magnitude in Iran
Right.
could trigger huge consequences across various sectors.
Yeah, it could destabilize the whole region
Yeah.
in ways that Afghanistan's economic woes at that time didn't.
Right, and to add another layer, the source points out that back then,
Yeah.
Afghanistan had virtually no domestic production.
Right.
I mean, from farming all the way to industry.
Right.
So, this kind of sets the stage for us to understand
Yeah.
the role that Iran played in the region, even while it's facing its own challenges now.
And that's a really interesting question that I think we need to explore.
Yeah.
What was Iran's position during that incredibly turbulent time in Afghanistan?
Right.
It's easy to forget that even countries grappling with their own internal issues can still play significant roles in the dynamics of their neighbors.
Absolutely. And the text highlights that back in 1997, despite any internal pressures Iran might have been under,
Yeah.
it was actually a significant provider of aid to various factions within Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Specifically, they were providing money and food to Ahmad Shah Massoud and the Islamic government.
Uh-huh.
Interestingly, they were also supplying weapons and military uniforms to Junbish-e-Milli Islami, which
Interesting.
controlled the northern part of the country.
Right, and what's fascinating here is just the complexity of the regional dynamics at play back then.
Yeah.
Iran wasn't the only external actor involved.
Right.
And the alliances and the support networks were often quite intricate and sometimes seemingly contradictory.
Oh, absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, the geopolitical landscape of 1997 Afghanistan was like a Gordian knot.
Yeah.
I mean, take Pakistan, for instance.
Yeah.
They were actively supporting the Taliban, who were fighting against the Islamic government.
Right.
Yet at the same time, Pakistan maintained political ties with that very same Islamic government.
It's wild.
And to make it even more convoluted, they were also sending arms and food to Junbish in the north.
Right. Yeah, you really have to kind of scratch your head and try to
Yeah.
unpack all of that.
It makes you wonder how those decisions are being made. Like,
Yeah.
who's sitting around a table deciding we're going to support all of these different groups that are fighting each other?
Yeah, yeah.
And then you had Turkey,
Right.
another interesting player in this
Yeah.
complex game. They maintained good political relations with the Islamic government,
No.
showing them, diplomatic respect.
Yeah.
But their military aid and the establishment of training centers
Right.
was primarily directed towards Junbish in the north.
Yeah.
The text even mentions the establishment of the first Afghan Turk school in Sheboygan as a sign of this support.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's almost like they were hedging their bets.
Yeah.
They wanted to maintain some level of influence no matter which way the wind blew.
Exactly. And then you had Russia, who seemed to be trying to cover all their bases as well.
Right. Classic Russia.
Classic Russia, right?
Yeah.
They were backing Ahmad Shah Massoud,
Uh-huh.
the defense minister within the Islamic government,
Yeah.
with weapons and equipment.
Right.
But at the same time,
Yeah.
they were also supplying various types of weapons to Junbish.
Yeah. It seems like everyone was trying to maintain influence across different factions simultaneously.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Just in case.
just in case.
Yeah.
It's so interesting.
Yeah.
And then Saudi Arabia's involvement is also quite noteworthy.
Oh, absolutely.
They were reportedly providing funds to the Taliban,
Mm.
aiming to bolster their influence.
Right.
But simultaneously, they supported the Islamic government and Ahmad Shah Massoud with essential services like schools and hospitals.
Right.
They even participated in reconstruction efforts in Kabul.
Wow.
And remarkably, they were also providing valuable gifts and dollars to Junbish.
Interesting.
The text even mentions Qatari and Arab dignitaries visiting the north for recreation and actually footing the bill
Wow.
for the fuel costs of Junbish and the Northern Alliance's air forces.
So they were bankrolling a lot of this.
It seems like it, yeah.
Yeah.
It paints a picture of significant financial backing coming from multiple, sometimes unexpected sources.
Right. Yeah. And it makes you think about, how much money was flowing into this conflict from all these different directions.
Yeah, and let's not forget India.
Right.
Their approach was
Yeah.
direct, to say the least.
Straightforward.
Yeah, straightforward.
Yeah.
They provided financial aid to both the Islamic government and to Junbish.
Mm-hmm.
And the text notes that this aid to Junbish was facilitated through their assassination in Mazar-e-Sharif.
Oh, wow.
That's a detail that definitely makes you pause.
Yeah.
And consider the clandestine and often brutal nature of this support.
That's a pretty chilling detail.
It is, yeah. So we have this incredibly intricate web of international actors,
Right.
all vying for influence and backing different sides in this conflict.
It's almost like a proxy war playing out.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how much of Iran's current situation is also influenced by these complex external forces,
Right.
even if they're not as overtly involved as they were in Afghanistan back then.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question, and it really underscores the deeply fragmented nature of Afghanistan at that time,
Right.
which is then mirrored in the description of the three main power centers within the country itself.
Right. The Taliban held control over the east and southeast.
Yeah.
The Islamic government was based in Kabul and held a limited number of other provinces, around 9.
Yeah.
Although their control, even within those, was often tenuous.
Right.
And then you had the Northern Alliance under the leadership of Junbish,
Yeah.
which held sway over 10 northern provinces,
Right.
where, interestingly, security was largely maintained based on the laws from the communist era.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so you have these remnants of the previous regime still kind of holding on in certain areas.
Yeah, it's like these layers of history all kind of overlapping and
Yeah, exactly.
clashing with each other.
It's wild. So this detailed backdrop of a fragmented Afghanistan
Yeah.
and this extensive involvement of all these external powers,
Right.
we arrive at the core argument of the source material.
Yeah.
This suggested parallel between the abandonment of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the Northern Alliance by their former international supporters, ultimately leading to the Taliban's victory.
Right.
And the current situation facing Iran.
Exactly. The author clearly sees some significant similarities there.
Yeah, and this leads us to the factors that the text suggests are contributing to Iran's perceived instability today.
Right.
And it seems to be a combination of pressures coming from both inside and outside the country.
Yeah, so it's not just one thing. It's this kind of perfect storm of internal and external pressures.
Yeah, and what's particularly striking is this assertion that despite Iran's progress in its nuclear program, it is reportedly losing the trust and confidence of its own people.
Right.
And this erosion of public faith is presented as a crucial factor, pushing the government closer to a potential collapse.
Exactly. I mean, if you lose the support of your people, it doesn't matter how powerful your military is or how advanced your nuclear program is.
Yeah, like the foundation is crumbling.
Exactly.
And the text highlights what it claims is a significant shift within Iran itself.
Okay.
The argument is that even figures within the Iranian leadership are now openly acknowledging the worsening economic and political situation.
That's huge.
Yeah, and the author contrasts this with how things supposedly were just a year ago, where such criticism would have been met with severe repercussions, possibly even imprisonment, or worse.
It's a very different environment now, it seems, than it was even a year ago.
Right. And the fact that these acknowledgments are now allegedly coming from within the leadership is presented as a key indicator of a changing dynamic.
That's significant.
Yeah.
It suggests that there's a growing sense of unease even among those in power.
Yeah. And then we have the increased activity and visibility of Western-based Iran opposition groups.
Right.
Actually, their growing presence and influence across online and traditional media platforms. So this suggests a potential amplification of dissenting voices and a challenge to the government's established narrative.
Absolutely. But the question is, how significant is this influence, really? Is there evidence that this is translating into widespread unrest within Iran, or is it primarily an online phenomenon?
Right. That's a really crucial question.
Yeah.
Because online dissent doesn't necessarily translate into boots on the ground.
Right.
And then we also have to consider the external pressures primarily from the U.S. and Israel.
Right.
The text highlights a specific instance,
a
phone call between then-President Trump and Putin, and notes the alleged lack of any significant defensive response from Russia towards Iran following this call.
Interesting.
Despite Iran being considered a key ally of Russia.
Right.
So the author interprets this as a sign of Iran's vulnerable position on the international stage, suggesting that even its supposed allies might not offer reliable support.
It's like they're being left out in the cold to fend for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. So to synthesize all of this, the source material paints a rather stark picture. It suggests that just as the former backers of the Afghan government and the Northern Alliance seem to withdraw their support, creating a power vacuum that the Taliban ultimately filled. A similar dynamic might be unfolding in the case of Iran.
Yeah, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes.
Right.
And there are definitely some unsettling echoes here.
Yeah, the severe economic difficulties, the signs of internal dissent, and the perceived lack of robust international support. They're all presented as interconnected pieces of this potentially catastrophic puzzle.
And the piece really drives home that central point about the economy. The author insists that Iran's current economic state, with that incredibly high exchange rate for the toman, is actually worse than what Afghanistan endured during a period of intense civil war and national fragmentation.
It's hard to even fathom that.
Yeah. I mean, think about the immediate practical consequences. For ordinary Afghans facing such a currency collapse back then, did it lead to widespread shortages or hyperinflation of everyday goods?
Right. And historical accounts from that period in Afghanistan do describe significant disruptions to daily life, including sharp increases in the prices of basic necessities and widespread economic hardship for ordinary citizens.
It must have been incredibly difficult for people just to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that Iran, with its, more developed economy, is now facing a potentially even more severe currency crisis, suggests the potential for very significant and widespread economic pain.
It's a worrying prospect.
Yeah.
And it raises a really critical question that I want to leave you with.
Okay.
Given these historical parallels that we've drawn,
Yeah.
and the combination of internal and external pressures, what do you think might be the most significant single factor that will ultimately determine the future trajectory of Iran?
It's a tough one.
Is it the depth of the economic crisis?
Right.
The extent of internal dissent? Or the shifting landscape of international relations and alliances?
Right.
It's clearly a very complex interplay of all of these different elements.
It really is. Yeah. And this deep dive, drawing on the analysis you shared with us, hopefully gives everybody listening a much more detailed and nuanced understanding of this really complex and significant situation that you might get from just scanning news headlines.
That's the goal, to go beyond the headlines.
Exactly.
And really dig into the complexities.
It's a solid foundation to think more critically about the dynamics at play in this really important region.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.